Hello, beautiful people. Today we're going to be talking about 9.3, solve quadratic equations, and 9-4, factoring to solve quadratic equations. Our SWABAT is to solve quadratic equations by taking the square roots and by factoring. So factoring we've covered in a previous chapter, and square roots you've seen before, but now we're going to use them to help us solve. A quadratic equation in standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So a, b, and c will be any numbers, and then your variable will always have an x squared. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't have that bx term, but you're always going to have a variable squared for a quadratic equation. This is in standard form because it's going to go from the highest degree to the smallest. So a little bit of vocabulary. Roots of the equation are also known as zeros of the equation. Those are basically the solutions of any quadratic equation and the x-intercepts of an equation as well. So if I were to graph it, then, and you'll learn a little bit more about this later, but if you were to graph it, you'd have possibly a parabola that looks like this, and it would hit the x-axis at 2 or 1 point, or maybe not at all, but the x-intercepts are also known as roots and zeros. Basically, they are the solutions when you solve a quadratic equation. 4 different ways to say the same thing: x-intercepts, solutions, roots, zeros. Sounds a lot more complicated than it is, but it's actually quite user-friendly. So for 9-3, solving quadratic equations, we're going to solve these by taking square roots. Solve each equation by finding the square roots. If the equation has no real solution, just write no solution. So we have t squared equals 25. Inverse operations, like opposite of or the inverse of addition, is subtraction. The inverse of multiplication is division because they undo each other. The inverse of squaring a number is to take the square root of it. So in order to get rid of that squared, I'm going to square root and square root on both sides. Square root of t squared is just t. Square root of 5, just kidding, gave you the answer there. Square root of 25 is 5. But when I'm thinking about the variable t here, t can definitely be 5 because 5 squared equals 25. But ask yourself this question: what else can t be? Well, t can also be negative 5. Because what's negative 5 squared? 25. So when you are taking the square root, you should have 2 answers. You should have 2 answers if you're taking the square root, as long as you're not taking the square root of 0. So another way to say this, though, is t equals positive and negative 5. If you only write 5 for your answer, you only have half of the solution, which means you only get half of the points. Not a good look. Don't forget the plus or minus. So letter B is slightly different because you have z squared minus 256 equals 0. So I'm going to first get the z squared by itself as it was for part A. So I'm going to add 256 on both sides, and I get z squared is equal to 256. Now I'll take the square root of both sides. Z equals, don't forget, plus could be positive, could be negative. And then the square root of 256 is 16. So I'll box that. Don't forget that plus or minus is super important. Okay, moving right along. I'm just stepping it up a little bit, notch by notch. And so now I still need to get the g squared by itself. What would I do first? Well, I'm not going to get this 2 yet. I'm going to go ahead and move the 32. So I'll add 32, and then I'll add 32, and I have 2g squared is equal to 0. Divide both sides by 2, and I find that g squared is equal to 0, because 0 divided by 2 is 0. Square root, g is equal to, now this is the only exception to the rule, 0. Because 0 is neither positive nor negative. It's kind of covered already in and of itself. So just g equals 0 for that one. And you can box it because it is now official. Okay, part D, isolating the variable, dividing by 3. I have a squared equals negative 9. Square root and square root, and I have a problem here, Houston. I cannot, it's not legal, not yet anyways, to take the square root of a negative number. So this has no real roots. This is where they're talking about this here. No real solution. So I'm just going to say no solution. Sneak peek, spoiler alert. In Algebra 2 Honors and Algebra 2, this does have a solution. It's an imaginary number, but we are only going to deal with the real ones here. So now we're going to talk about 9-4, and that was all about solving by factoring. But first, in order to do that, even to talk about it, we have to know about the zero product property, which says that if A times B equals 0, then either A equals 0 or B equals 0. So looking at this, it's like saying you have two numbers in your head, and when I multiply those two numbers, you get 0. Well, in order for you to get 0, one of those numbers has to be 0, or both. So this could be 0, this could be 0, or they can both be 0. Because when I multiply them, that's what I should get. So for 9-4, the introduction to solving by factoring, use the zero product property. That's all we want to do first. We love part A and B because they're both already in factored form. So thinking about this property, you should have two separate equations because you have two different factors. So my first one is going to be 8t minus 7 equals 0, or, because this is like your A and this is like your B, or 3t plus 5 equals 0. From here, I'm in great shape because I can solve these. I'm going to add 7, 8t equals 7, divide by 8, divide by 8. So t is equal to 7/8. Then I'm also going to solve the other equation, so minus 5 minus 5. 3t equals negative 5, divide by 3, and t is equal to negative 5/3. Or, I'm just going to put an or in between there. You have two answers because you had two different factors. You had an A and a B for that one. And that's it for using the zero product property. So looking at B, also already factored, I'm going to show you this, and you're going to see and like, oh, that's kind of easy. 3m equals 0 and 2m plus 9 equals 0. Only issue here is this, where people have to divide by 3 for some reason. I don't know what happens, but it should be m equals 0, because 0 divided by 3 is 0. And then for this one, just a little bit more work than the other. 2m is equal to negative 9, divided by 2, m equals 9 halves. So m equals 0 or 9 halves. I don't care if you read it this way or this way, but on an answer column, you're probably going to want to write it like that. It's a little bit shorter. Okay, that is your introduction to the zero product property. Next thing we want to do is to solve now by factoring. Well, if I need to solve by factoring, first thing I need to do is to factor, obviously. So if you look at part A, it was a wonderful blessing because it was already factored. Now we'll just do a little bit of work in order to do it ourselves. I'm going to take you back and do this with the box. Where do I want to write it? I think I'm going to go ahead and write my box here. Stepping outside the box, I'm going to do it over here. So my first term goes in my first box. My last term goes into my last box. And I'm looking for two numbers that will multiply to give me 24z squared, and that will add to give me negative 10z. I'm thinking negative 6z and negative 4z. Negative 6 times negative 4 is 24. Negative 6 plus negative 4 is negative 10. So those work. So factoring now, these both have a z in common. These both have a negative 6 in common. These have a z in common. And these two both have a negative 4 in common. So in factored form, z minus 6 times z minus 4, don't forget the rest of this, this was an equation originally, equals 0. So I'll set up my two equations, z minus 6 equals 0, z minus 4 equals 0. Add 6, and I have z equals 6, and then for this one I'll add 4 and add 4, and I get z equals 4. So z equals 6 or z equals 4, that's solving by factoring. And what we're saying basically is if I plug in 6 into the original equation, I should get 0. I'm going to check one. I know you don't, but I'm going to do it anyways. So just as a check, thank you for humoring me, z squared, 6 squared, minus 10 times 6 plus 24. We're checking to see because we're saying that's a 0, that it should equal 0. 36 minus 60 plus 24 should equal 0. These two combined is negative 24 plus 24 does equal 0. Check. 6 is a 0. You don't have to check everything. I was just showing you that if you were to plug in this number, you would get a 0. If you were to plug in this number, you would get a 0. Going back, if I were to plug in 7/8 into this equation, I would get 0. So that's all. Which is why, throwback, back here, we're saying that there's zeros of the equation. Zeros are solutions of the equation. Zeros, solutions. Roots, we'll talk a little bit more later, and x-intercepts later when we start to graph these, or when we graph these in 9.1 and 9.2. Alright, so here we are. The next one I want to do is to solve by factoring. This looks a little bit different though from the previous one. It's because I was just telling you, you need to find zeros. This side does not equal 0. So in order to solve by factoring, that's your first step. You have to make one side of the equation equal to 0. Then you can factor using your regular old factor box and whatnot. So there's my box, my first term, first box, last term, last box. And I am looking for two numbers that will multiply to give me negative 18b squared, and that will add to give me 7b. The numbers I'm thinking are 2b and 9b, and I think the 9b has to be positive because my answer is positive. So 9b and negative 2b. Okay, factoring, these both have a b in common. These have a 3 in common. These two have a 3b in common. And these have a negative 2. So in factored form, I have b plus 3 times 3b minus 2 equals 0. Now we're going to solve. b plus 3 equals 0, and 3b minus 2 equals 0. Minus 3 minus 3. b equals negative 3. And for this one, 3b equals 2, so divide by 3. b equals 2/3. So on an answer column, I write b equals negative 3 and then 2/3. I typically write my answers in order from biggest to smallest if I combine them, but it's not required. Okay, next example. This looks way different. I'm going to tell you this problem is actually not crazy difficult, but people make up their own math. Don't do that. Some people would want to divide both sides by 5 or divide both sides by d. Both are a bad situation. Instead, like we said for the previous example, we want to get everything on one side. So minus 5d. Minus 5d. I have d squared minus 5d, because these are not like terms, equals 0. And now I have a 0. I'm going to factor now. What goes into d squared and d? D. So I'm going to have left over d minus 5, because I took a d off of both of these, equals 0. Now the zero product property, d equals 0, I'm just going to set each factor equal to 0, and d minus 5 equals 0. Well, this is already solved. Delightful. So d equals 5. So on my answer column, or for my final answer, I'm going to say d is equal to 0 or 5. And there you go. So now you have some practice problems to do on your own, which are due today. Thank you so much, and have a great day.